learn when we see how God used languages in the Bible to preserve his word for humankind. There are lessons we can learn, and I want to begin with that before I get into the technicalities. Two major points that we can learn from how God used languages in inspiring the Holy Scriptures that you have in front of you, most of you in an English translation, I suppose, and various ones perhaps that you're using. In Acts 10 and verse 34, Peter was inspired to declare, in Acts 10 verse 34, "Then Peter opened his mouth and said, 'In truth, I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him.'" So we see that in New Covenant times, in New Testament times, the church is universal. It is worldwide. We know that God does intend ultimately to convert the human race. However, we also understand that he has a plan, that he is going step by step through a plan. Now, most of you who are listening to me probably keep not only the weekly Sabbath, but also the annual festivals, and therefore you review from year to year God's plan in the harvest cycle that the holy days connect to. And so we understand that in using different languages to preach his word, he was in effect following his plan. So the next point I want to get to is 1 Corinthians, the 14th chapter. And here, in talking about the services of the church, when people gather together to be instructed, as you heard in the opening prayer, Paul writes here in 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 40, he says, "Let all things be done decently and in order." So God does have a plan. He wants to convert the human race, but he has a timetable and he has a plan. And we can learn, we can get certain insights into how God operates when we go into the languages of the Bible. Now, the festival of Pentecost is very interesting because it ties in with languages, different languages. As you know, a great miracle, well, 7 miracles occurred on Pentecost, and 2 of which involved language. The apostles were speaking in languages that they did not know. And also, 15 different ethnic groups are mentioned there who listened and heard what was being said in their own particular languages. So through language, through that miracle, God was in effect showing his concern for all of humanity. But he was also unifying those who were there in a great miracle of bringing about a great unity. Now, in Genesis 11, he had done something different. He had divided nations by language because it was his intent for the good of the human race that they not all be together in one place under one authority. It would have been evidently self-destructive, and history would have come to a climax a lot sooner. So God deliberately used language then to separate humankind, and this has been the state of humanity ever since, people speaking different languages. But even then, God did it, although he in effect confused the languages, he did so in order. He had different families that were grouped together and speaking different languages, as we'll see. Now, one could speculate that in the millennium, would we have one universal language? Well, we know that God does intend that every nation of every language would ultimately come to an understanding of his way of life and a relationship with him. If you go to the book of Daniel, the 7th chapter and the 14th verse, here is a vision of the future, the coming of Christ. 7:14 of Daniel. "Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed." But it would seem that perhaps in the millennium there will be one universal language that we'll be able to learn, so that we have a certain unity in the world, and maybe we'll also have individual nations speaking individual languages, because we are human and limited, and no one language really fully captures what humanity can do. It's like different forms of music. So that remains to be seen. But I do want to turn to prophecy in Zephaniah along those lines. That gives us some food for thought. in the 3rd chapter of the book of Zephaniah, and verse 9, he says this prophecy, "For then I will restore to the peoples a pure language," safa burura, a pure lip, a pure language, "that they all may call on the name of the Eternal to serve him with one accord." Now, you could take this more than one way. It could simply mean that he will purify our language so that we will, properly express our thoughts and along the lines of biblical principles and all be unified. But it may even imply one language for humanity at that time. Now, it served God's purpose so that to divide humanity linguistically over the centuries. And archaeology shows us that he also did this before the flood. There were different languages of humanity pre-flood. So the situation in Genesis 11 was, in a way, unique in human history. For so many people to be in one place speaking one language, it was a special time. And God, of course, intervened and changed it. But I want to show you a scripture which would go along with what archaeology has shown us, that God divided up the human race linguistically prior to the flood as well, as in Genesis 11. And we can go to Deuteronomy 32. In Jewish tradition, there's the concept of the 70 languages of the world, the 70 major, I guess you could say, ethnic identities. Israel and the 70 nations, that's the Jewish tradition, and it's a kind of rounded off figure from 72. In other words, we would have the 12 tribes of Israel and I guess 6 Gentile nations associated with each of the tribes, and so you wind up with 72. But there is a point to that. In Acts 17, it shows that God is the master geopolitician, and he guided and directed history so certain people settled in certain areas. He has prophesied ahead of time what is going to happen, and he will bring it to pass. And much of what he did was so that he could work with a particular nation in ancient times, the people of Israel. He placed them in the center of the world in a way where Europe, Asia, and Africa come together. He put them in what we call the Middle East, in the Mediterranean. Mediterranean means center of the world. And he put them in a land bridge where Europe, Asia, and Africa come together. And he intended, of course, for them to play an important role in setting an example, which, of course, they didn't do, but should have done. So he did direct human events and world affairs to a large degree related to his people Israel in ancient times. And in Deuteronomy 32, in verse 8, Moses says, "When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of children of Israel." I emphasized Adam for a reason. See, it doesn't say he separated the sons of Noah, which he did, but it actually says he separated the sons of Adam. So even though Moses is talking here about Israel and their relationship to the Gentile nations, he does talk about the fact that God separated the sons of Adam. And so the implication is that even in the pre-flood world, we were divided, our human race was divided linguistically, which was the case. Now, I'd like to look at how God used different languages in the Bible by going to Genesis 10. Here you have the table of nations. And it says that the nations were divided linguistically, and then Genesis 11 tells you how. So first we're told that it's a fact, and then Genesis 11 tells us how it happened, the Tower of Babel. In Genesis 10, we have Genesis 10. Now this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And sons were born to them after the flood. And if you go to verse 5, first we're talking here about Japheth. "From these the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations." Then we deal with the children of Ham. And then if you go down to verse 20, "These were the sons of Ham according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands, and in their nations." Then if you go to the end of the chapter, now we're dealing with Shem. "These were the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands, according to their nations." So once again we find languages. And then finally at the end, these were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations, in their nations, and from these nations were divided on, and from these the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. And how God did it particularly is found in Genesis 11. So if we look at the three branches of humankind, we find that God first spoke, inspired scriptures through a dialect of the Canaanites who were descendants of Ham. If you look at the genealogy of Ham, you'll find that verse 6, one of his sons was Canaan. And the Hebrew is a Canaanite dialect. And so, in a sense, a language of Ham was used to preserve the Old Testament scriptures. It's interesting that when the Bible speaks of the conversion of the Egyptians in the end time, here's how it covers it. This is Isaiah 19 and verse 18. If you go to Isaiah 19 and verse 18, in that day, 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan. So the Egyptians who speak Arabic will be learning Hebrew, which is closely related. In fact, I would say that Hebrew in a way is like a simplified Arabic. So if you could master Arabic, you could master Hebrew. And why would they want to learn Hebrew? Well, they would want to get back to the roots of God's religion, the Hebrew roots. That's a big trend nowadays, right? Hebrew roots. In that day, 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Eternal of hosts. One will be called the city of destruction. I'd like to go now to Psalm 114, with which a lot of you are very familiar. When the Israelites went out of Egypt, they were leaving a people of strange language, but they were going to a place where they could be generally understood, whose languages they generally understood. Psalm 114. When Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language. So they were leaving the Egyptians who spoke Egyptian, whereas they were speaking a dialect which was generally intelligible to the Canaanitish peoples where they were heading. And that's probably why the spies were able to communicate with Rahab in Joshua 2. You find the spies communicating with Rahab there. All right, so that takes care of one branch of the human race, Ham. Now let's go to Shem. And if we go now to the genealogy of Shem, this is in verse 22 of Genesis 10. The sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. Now Aram is the ancestor of the peoples who lived in Syria in biblical times, and the Aram gave us the Aramaic language, the language of Syria. And it is sometimes called in the Old King James Syriac, and the modern form of Aramaic is called Syriac. The three languages of the Bible that God used to inspire his scriptures, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, none of them became extinct. All of those languages were preserved in history. Aramaic is a version of Aramaic is still spoken, although we should be praying about those people. The Christians in the Middle East are being driven out and wiped out, and many of them are the last surviving speakers of the language that Jesus spoke, Aramaic, and right now they're suffering tremendous persecution. But of course, the Jews also preserved Aramaic in their study of the Talmud and some of the material in the Bible, which is in the Aramaic language, and they did preserve the Hebrew language, and now it's once again a conversational language. Millions of people speak it every day. And of course, Greek is not only a major world language, but it has influenced most of the languages of the Western world, including, of course, also the Eastern European languages, Russian and so on. Well, let's get to Greek. So now we come to the children of Japheth, and here we have in Genesis 10:2, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Javan is the Hebrew word for Greece. Javan, Yavan, is the Hebrew word for Greece. So God used the Greek language, the language of Javan. So here you see that God used three languages for the three branches of humanity. From Ham we get Hebrew, from Shem we get Aramaic, from Japheth we get Greek. The Hebrew language is what we find in the beginning. If you look at Genesis 10, we're still there. You find Nimrod and some of his activities. And notice in verse 10 of Genesis 10, he established certain cities. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. You'll read about that in Genesis 11. Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar, or ancient Sumer, where civilization, one of the early civilizations, of course, some of the earliest civilization was in Sumer, and they gave us some institutions we still use today. I believe our time of 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and so on, is based on the Sumerian way of keeping time. Anyway, one of the ancient cities was Akkad. You see it in your Bible, Genesis 10:10. So in Mesopotamia, in what is today Iraq, there was an ancient language called Akkadian, and it was very similar to biblical Hebrew and influenced it. And Abraham probably started out his life speaking Akkadian. Then Abraham crossed the Euphrates River, and as God told him, get you out of your country. So he left Babylon behind and crossed the Euphrates River. Now, in one sense, the word Hebrew generally can be looked upon as the descendants of Eber. However, more specifically, the term Hebrew has come to be used for the descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. That is to say, it has become a synonym for the Israelites. And Abraham had that title of Hebrew because he had crossed the Euphrates River. A Hebrew is one who has crossed over, and that's what he did. And it was a type of baptism. He in effect crossed the Euphrates River, leaving Babylon behind and going to where God wanted him to go. And in Genesis 14 and verse 13, you see Abraham called the Hebrew. Genesis 14 and verse 13. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, and the Amorite brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner. These were allies with Abram. So he was Abram the Hebrew in Genesis 14:13. So his language we can call Hebrew, the Abrahamic dialect of Canaanite. He was father of a clan, patriarch of a clan. Later on, of course, we have Jacob and his 12 sons, and they develop into a great nation speaking that Hebrew language. Now, to the north of the land of Israel was Syria, where they spoke Aramaic. And 4 portions of the Bible are in Aramaic. Aramaic became the imperial language, the language of the empire based in Iraq. First we had the Assyrian Empire, then we had the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Chaldean Empire of the Babylonians. And so Aramaic became spread out throughout the Middle East and became the imperial language. And more of the Bible came to be used in that language as God began to reach out beyond Israel to the Gentiles. The first use of Aramaic we find is in Genesis 31 and verse 47. There are 4 sections of the Old Testament where you find Aramaic. And in Genesis 31 and verse 47, here Jacob and Laban make a pact, a covenant. And notice what happens linguistically here. Verse 46 of Genesis 31. Then Jacob said to his brethren, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there on the heap. And Laban called it Yegar Saduta. That's Aramaic. What does it mean? Heap of witness. But Jacob called it Galeed. He spoke Hebrew, and he called it heap of witness. So you see, you have the Aramaic and the Hebrew. Laban to the north spoke Aramaic, and Jacob spoke Hebrew. So it's Yegar Saduta in Syria, and it's Galeed in the land of Israel. Is everybody okay on that one? So that's a brief allusion to Aramaic. But then we have a really dramatic use of it in the book of Jeremiah. At this point, well, no, let's go to 2 Kings to get a little bit of background here. 2 Kings 18. If you want to defeat a nation, you want to try to demoralize them. And when the Assyrians came to try to conquer the Jews, they try to propagandize them and demoralize them. So I guess that some of them knew enough Hebrew to get up there and speak in Hebrew and try to intimidate the people. And so the leaders of the Jews, because they were diplomats, because they were leaders, they spoke Aramaic, which was the international language, the lingua franca of the day. So they talked to the Assyrians in Aramaic, and they said, don't speak to the people in Hebrew. You can talk to us in Aramaic. We understand that we're the VIPs, but the average person understands Hebrew, but don't speak to them in Hebrew. We don't want you to demoralize our population. That's in 2 Kings 18:26. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, Shebna, and Joan said to the Rabshakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it, but do not speak to us in Jewish, is what the Bible says, Yehudit. That's where the name Judith comes from. And my New King James says Hebrew, but the word here is Yehudit. Don't speak to us in Jewish, because Hebrew was the language of the Jews at that time. Some of your translations say don't speak to us in the language of the Jews. And do not speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people who are on the wall. But the Rabshakeh said to them, has my master sent me to your master and to you to speak these words, and not to the men who sit on the wall, who will eat and drink their own waste with you? Very arrogant. Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out with a loud voice in it says here Hebrew, in the Jews' land, in Judean, it says in my margin, in Judean, and spoke, saying, hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. So here you see the linguistic difference. The Jews were speaking Hebrew, and to the northeast, they were speaking Aramaic. Well, Jeremiah has a very dramatic passage in his prophecy. Jeremiah, the 10th chapter. Imagine you're back before World War II, and you're witnessing to the British people. And you're telling the British people, you're about to go through a terrible trial. You're about to be having a great war with the German people. And then in the middle of this, let's say, declaration that you write and you print it and you distribute it throughout the British Isles, you have one sentence in German. So they're reading along in English, and then they come to a sentence in German. That'll jump right out at them, right? But that also means that the Germans who are being used to test the British, they're going to see that statement and understand it. So let's take a look. So in Jeremiah 10, we are in verse 10, which is in Hebrew. But the Eternal is the true God. He is the living God and the everlasting King. At his wrath the earth will tremble, and the nations will not be able to endure his indignation. Then he switches to Aramaic. Thus you shall say to them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth. Now, my Bible, unfortunately, doesn't note that. If you have not that I want to criticize the Bible that I use, but if you got a really good Bible, it'll tell you that this is in a different language. Some of you, I hope, have that in your margin, that verse 11 is in Aramaic. I will tell you that the peoples who lived in Mesopotamia were the Chaldeans, and so that is why sometimes the language was called, in old Bibles, Chaldee, or the Chaldean language. You may have that term in your Bible. Anyway, verse 11. Thus shall you say to them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth shall perish from the earth and from under these heavens. So he's saying, you who are being used to punish my people, your gods and goddesses are utterly worthless. I'm in charge. I'm using you, but you'll be held accountable for your behavior. So verse 11 is in an international language that Gentiles could understand. And then in verse 12, he goes back to Hebrew again. Very dramatic. Now, let's go to the book of Daniel. Daniel by now is in captivity, and now the Jews, the God's church at that time, are in exile, in captivity, in the, as I said, the Babylonian or Neo-Chaldean Empire. So they're in what is today Iraq, and the people around them speak Aramaic. The book of Daniel begins with miraculous stories about Daniel and the three young Jews that were with him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the Babylonian names by which they're more well known. And so Daniel and the three men, and you read miraculous accounts. And then the second half are very specific prophecies. And some of them are, of course, go right into the end time. Now, if you went to a university and you studied the Bible, they would tell you Daniel was the last book of the Bible, because they believe that at least the last part of Daniel was written a century and a half before Christ. Why? Because the prophecies are so specific that a professor at perhaps Madison there, or wherever you went to school, a professor would probably say, well, these are so specific, they must have been a report about these events by a contemporary or by somebody who lived afterwards, because how could a prophecy be so detailed? But of course they were. But the way the book of Daniel is structured, it's very hard to split it into two parts. It's very hard to say, well, the first part was the part that is really Daniel, and the second part were later history, later comments, sort of pretending to be Daniel as if they were prophecy when they're really history. But it's hard to divide the book, as I'll show you in a minute, because of the languages in the book. They bind the book together in a very special way. And Daniel is a very special book because it is a bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. As you know from Daniel 9. Daniel 9, the way you have it in your translation is the way it's written in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. Daniel 9 points directly to the ministry of Jesus Christ. So the book of Daniel does really tie in the New Testament and the Old Testament. And in the Hebrew order of the books, it's very late. It's the 20th book in the order. I believe Daniel, right? Daniel, yeah, it's the 20th book in the order. So it's very late in the 20. If you want to look at the Bible as Josephus did, 22 books in the Old Testament. The last two would be Ezra, Nehemiah, one book, First and Second Chronicles, one book, and so Daniel would be book 20 of the 22. So it's very late, and as I said, it ties the two testaments together. Now the book of Daniel has a kind of interlocking connection that makes it very hard to split the book into two parts. As I said, critics have a hard time with Daniel because the prophecies are so specific. Years ago, somebody wrote a book called Daniel in the Critics' Den, kind of a humorous way to talk about it. Let's go to Daniel 2 and verse 4. Then the Chaldeans, now so far the book is in Hebrew. We're reading right along in Hebrew. And then in Daniel 2 verse 4, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. And guess what? Beginning with that quotation, it quotes them in Aramaic. It switches languages. So this is in the middle of a verse. So it's Daniel 2, 4b. And it's in the middle of the verse. And then it goes all through the first 6 chapters of Daniel, but then also into the 7th. The prophetic material begins in Aramaic all the way to verse 28 of Daniel 7. I have a good margin here. It mentions in Daniel 8:1, the Hebrew language resumes in Daniel 8:1. So you see the two halves of Daniel are tied together because the Aramaic part continues from Daniel 2:4b through the 6 chapters and into the 7th, into the prophetic part. Because this is material that God wanted Gentiles to be aware of. This is written in Aramaic so that the Babylonians around there and other learned people would be able to read it. And so beginning in Daniel 2:4b, it's in Aramaic, all through the 3rd chapter and 4th and 5th, which are very important in terms of prophecies involving the Gentile world. If you're students of Bible prophecy, as probably some of you are. But then when you get to Daniel 8, these prophecies very much are centered on the church and are very much for God's people. So beginning in Daniel 8, you go back to Hebrew. So is everybody still following me? So Daniel 2:4b through Daniel 7:28 is the third part of the Bible that's in Aramaic. And while I'm on the subject, since I'm in Daniel and I don't want to have to turn back there later, I want to save you the trouble. We'll be efficient and turn to Daniel 3 now. Here you begin to see a little hint of what God is going to eventually do, which is to reach out even beyond the Middle East to Europe and beyond, using the Greek language for the New Testament. In Daniel 3 and verse 5, I have here my New King James. Then at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony, with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Symphony, that's a Greek word. The Aramaic is symponia. Symponia is directly a borrowing from Greek. In other words, the Aramaic borrowed from the Greek. So here you have a Greek word in Daniel. And you find it again, I think it's in verse 10. You, O king, have made a decree, verses Daniel 3:10, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony, symponia is the Aramaic, and it comes from the Greek symphonia in Greek, with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. So here you see some bit of Greek in here, so that shows you as God is using Aramaic, but even Greek, because that's the next step. That's going to be the next step. And by the way, by the time you get to the intertestamental period, God's people, at that time the Jews, that was the church of that day, they were having their problems, obviously, and Christ came to had a lot to say about the scribes and Pharisees, but he was speaking from within the church, criticizing the leaders of the church of that day. And at that time, God's church was beginning to use Greek terminology. For example, the term Sanhedrin, or Sanhedrin, some pronounce it in American English. The term Sanhedrin is in Hebrew, but it's a Greek word that is borrowed into Hebrew. And also in John 14, Christ speaks of the Holy Spirit using the Greek term parakletos, which your Bibles often translate as comforter. Well, that word has come into Hebrew, paraklet, or advocate. That word has come from Greek into Hebrew. So you see that by New Testament times, the Jews themselves were beginning to use, at times, Greek terminology. And eventually, of course, as you know, God used Greek in the New Testament. But I'm not there yet entirely. I'm still in the Old Testament. So I hope I haven't jumped ahead too far. Let's go back now to Old Testament. And we have the Greek, we have the Hebrew in Genesis. I'm sorry, the Aramaic in Genesis. We had the Aramaic in Jeremiah. We had the Aramaic in Daniel. There's one last section of the Old Testament in Aramaic, and that's in the book of Ezra. And here we have historical material where it's important for the Gentiles to be aware of this history, and certain official documents are quoted in the imperial language in which they were written, Aramaic. So I go to Ezra 4, and here we see efforts to thwart God's people, rebuilding the temple and then rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. So in Ezra 4, I'm now going to verse 7 of Ezra 4. In the days of Artaxerxes also, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabel, and the rest of their companions wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the letter was written in Aramaic script and translated into the Aramaic language. And guess what? In verse 8, it's in Aramaic. And it continues, the document is quoted, and then the history is given. And so the Gentiles can read about what happened. And you're still in Aramaic when you get to chapter 6. And then finally, you get to the conclusion. Let's go to verse 18. We're talking now about the rebuilding of the temple, the rededication of the temple in 516 BC. Verse 18. This is still Aramaic. They assigned a priest to their divisions and the Levites to their divisions over the service of God in Jerusalem, clarifying to the Gentiles what we're talking about, as is written in the book of Moses. And now verse 19, and I hope your Bibles note this in your margin. This now, Hebrew resumes here, because we're talking now about keeping the Passover. So now we're getting back into church business. So we gave the Gentiles a general overview of the history, and now talking about the Passover, we come to Ezra 6:19, and we're back into Hebrew again. But there's one last section in Aramaic. When Ezra returns, he returns with authority. He is going to rule over the Jews in the land of Israel, and they're going to be able to have local autonomy and to institute the Old Covenant there. Yes, they are subject to the Persian Empire, and they have to send their tribute back to what is today Iran. But nevertheless, they have local autonomy, and Ezra is going to be able to enforce the Old Testament there. So he has a document along those lines. So let's go to verse 11 of Ezra 7. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave Ezra, the priest, the scribe, expert in the words of the commandment of the Eternal and of his statutes to Israel. And now in verse 12, that's Aramaic, and it goes all the way to the end of the document. Look at what this document says, the authority it gave to Ezra, and it's quoted in Aramaic so the Gentiles could read it. Whoever will not observe the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily on him, whether it be death or banishment or confiscation of goods or imprisonment. All right, so that's the authority, and it's there in the imperial language for people to read. And then when Ezra begins to pray, it gets back into Hebrew. Blessed be the eternal God of our fathers, who has put such a thing as this in the king's heart, to beautify the house of the Eternal which is in Jerusalem. Now, the Bible notices that language shows the kind of people you are in a certain way. In other words, when the Jews returned from captivity, they had their language. And so if they were rearing their children in the traditions of God's way of life, their children would have been speaking their parents' language. And now Nehemiah found that many of the children were speaking Gentile languages. So this was showing him that these children were assimilating Gentile ways, which is very scary. They were exiled and punished for that before. Now he's trying to restore the Jews, and here we find parents, intermarrying and children growing up speaking Gentile languages. This is indicative of losing their identity as part of God's church. So if you look at Nehemiah 13 and verse 23. I'm in Nehemiah 13:23. In those days I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And probably at this point Jews were still speaking Hebrew, and these other languages were different enough that you could tell if a person was speaking Ashdodite, Ammonite, and Moabite versus Hebrew. And half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one or the other people. And so this is a problem because it shows that they're assimilating that culture. So I contended with them and cursed them, struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, saying, "You shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves." This has to do, of course, with not marrying idolatrous people. You know the kind of things that idolatrous people did. You can read about it in the Bible and in ancient history. So this was not for God's people to do, to mix with such people. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused him, even him, to sin. Should we then hear of your thing? Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women? So, of course, it wasn't a racial thing or an ethnic thing. It was a spiritual thing. These were idolatrous people, and he did not want people marrying into idolatrous families, obviously. And one giveaway that showed that people were losing their identity was they were losing their language. Now, there is a lesson to be learned here. There are certain ways we speak that ought to be different from the way others speak. Of course, basically, we should be honest. Many people are not. But that's, of course, maybe a different point. But one point is that our language ought to be free from cursing and expletives and the kind of expressions people use. We ought to be, in a way, distinguished by our speech. Not that we try to be, self-righteous, but we should keep our language appropriate and not, be taking God's name in vain and so on, or using a lot of the expletives that are so commonly used. We ought to be at least noticeably not doing that. Yeah. And so if we are, that's probably an indication that we're assimilating too much of this culture. If we find ourselves using a lot of this kind of language, we might want to catch ourselves. How much more are we absorbing of this world's culture? I've told the story about my wife before, but possibly a lot of you don't listen to me every Sabbath, so you may not have caught this story. And now a little bit of a plug. If you want to listen to me on the Sabbath, I speak at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and so that would be 2 o'clock in the Midwest, and so on down the line. No, I speak at 2 o'clock. I apologize. 2 p.m. Eastern time. 2 p.m. Eastern time. 1 o'clock in Wisconsin. 11 o'clock right in California, 11 a.m. out in California. So before you have lunch, you can listen and then hopefully enjoy your lunch all the more, I hope. Not have indigestion from what you heard, but actually enjoy your lunch because of what you heard, I hope. But anyway, a story now about my wife. She was, before she married me, this was a long time ago. We've been married, we're in our 45th year now. Of being married, but a long time ago she was working in Dallas in an office, and the people around there were cursing the air blue all the time, and she was working there, and finally one day something bad happened, and she didn't say anything, but it came into her mind. This really bad language came into her mind, so she said, "Enough of this," and so she got herself her own private office away from the rest of the crowd, where she wouldn't have to hear that kind of language all the time. So anyway, I want to now go on to the next stage of this, and that is the fact that over time, Aramaic, the imperial language, became the language even of the Jews in the land of Israel. More and more they began to speak Aramaic as their common language. They did not lose Hebrew, but it became more the language of the scribes and Pharisees, the rabbis, the learned people. Just as in the Middle Ages, the monks and the priests spoke Latin, but the average people spoke languages that developed into French and Spanish and the various languages. So in the land of Israel, when Jesus Christ walked this earth, the Jews were speaking what I would call Jewish Aramaic. And so Jesus' spoken language, conversational language was Aramaic, but it was a Jewish Aramaic, and he very likely knew Hebrew. He knew the scriptures in Hebrew, so he would have known Aramaic and Hebrew. He probably had at least some knowledge of Greek and of Latin from the Roman soldiers who were there. So very likely Jesus Christ was a polyglot who knew Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, conversational Aramaic, and possibly some Greek and Latin. But anyway, I want to talk about now the New Testament. And it had to be preserved in Greek because the Jewish establishment rejected Jesus Christ. The Jewish community as a whole rejected him. Now, the early church was Jewish, but it was a sect within Judaism, and eventually was banished. You could say kicked out, and so the bulk of the Jews did not accept Christianity, so they obviously could not preserve the Christian scriptures. So the scriptures went to the Greek-speaking world. If you go to the book of Romans, that's talked about there. In Romans 1 and verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek." Oh, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. So the Greeks here are standing for the Gentiles in general, but he does specify Greek. And then in Romans 2 and verse 10, well, let's go with 9 and 10. "Tribulation and anguish on every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first and also of the Greek. But glory and honor and peace to everyone who works what is good, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." It would have been useless to write the letters of Paul in Hebrew to the churches where people spoke Greek. It would have been useless. The church of God is symbolized in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, by 7 cities: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, Greek-speaking cities. The gospel was preserved, the gospel of Jesus Christ was preserved in Greek. However, Jesus spoke Jewish Aramaic, so sometimes when Jesus is quoted, his precise words are quoted, they're written in Greek letters, but they're written in Aramaic, and then translated into Greek. So let's go to Mark, chapter 15, and verse 34. "Now, Hebrew and Aramaic are written with the same alphabet." So you can write Hebrew and Aramaic. You don't have, with the same alphabet is used. So your Old Testament has the same alphabet throughout. Hebrew and Aramaic are written with the same alphabet. When the Jews came back from captivity, they were trying to preserve God's truth. There was a counterfeit religion to the north, the Samaritans, and they had the old Hebrew script. So the Jews switched to Aramaic script, very likely in an effort to preserve their holy scriptures. And so beginning 2,500 years ago, Hebrew began to be written with the Aramaic script. That's why, if you see the movie The 10 Commandments, if you see Charlton Heston comes down with these tablets written in Hebrew, but it's not the Hebrew of last 2,500 years. It's the older Hebrew. They had a Semitic scholar in the University of Chicago who knew those older Hebrew letters, so that's what they used. That was authentic. Although, by the way, just as a side point, he has them condensed there. He doesn't have all the commandments on those tablets. It's a sort of abbreviated version. But anyway, as I'm trying to say, the alphabet that we have today is an ancestor of the old Hebrew alphabet. A descendant of the old Hebrew alphabet. It went from, that's why we call it the alphabet. Aleph and Bet are the first letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The Greeks called them alpha beta. We have the term alphabet. Our alphabet came originally from the Hebrew, and of course the Canaanites had that alphabet, the Phoenicians, so they spread it around the Mediterranean, as did probably Solomon's ships as well. The Phoenicians are given all the credit, but I would give Israel credit as well for the spread of the alphabet. But anyway, the ancient Hebrew alphabet, as I said, was scrapped 2,500 years ago for the Aramaic alphabet, and that's what Hebrew has used for the last 25 centuries. Now we go to the Greek alphabet and the Greek language in the New Testament, and now I go to Mark 13 and verse 34. Mark 13 and verse 34, and here Jesus is quoted directly, speaking Jewish Aramaic as he's about to die. Verse 34, "At the 9th hour," which is of course 3 o'clock in the afternoon, "at the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani." So this is basically Jewish Aramaic, and he's reciting, of course, Psalm 22 verse 1, which was a prophecy of what would happen to him. And so, but you see, Mark, he writes this in Greek letters, and his audience can't understand it, so he has to translate it into Greek. So he does, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So you find throughout the New Testament occasional Aramaic phrases, and they're translated into Greek. Now, it's interesting that the church had some phrases kind of in speak within the church. And I want to go to 1 Corinthians 16. 1 Corinthians 16, which talks about Pentecost, which is a festival when we think about languages, different languages. 1 Corinthians 16. And there was some in-speak in the church. Now, I was part of a church that for many years, the physical head of the church, the pastor general, as we used to call him, would come out on the Sabbath and he would say Shabbat Shalom in Hebrew. And then on the festival days, he would say Chag Sameach in Hebrew. Then he would speak English, but this became kind of like the church in-speak. And so within the church, even though most people didn't speak Hebrew, on the Sabbath, many of the members would say Shabbat Shalom, and on the holy days, many would say Chag Sameach. Well, the Apostle Paul did that in Corinth. Evidently, the Greek-speaking church in those days had an Aramaic phrase they used to use as a kind of in-speak in the church, a way to greet one another, or to make a point more emphatically. It was a phrase they used to use. So if you go to 1 Corinthians 16, and I want to go to verse 22, if anyone does not love the Lord Jesus Christ, let him be anathema. You know the Greek word. And of course, even though you know it, the New King James decided to say accursed, but it says anathema in your margin. And then he goes on to say, Maranatha, Aramaic. It's written in Greek letters, but it's an Aramaic phrase. Now, they translate it here in my Bible, O Lord, come. And then in my margin it says, Maranatha, or which means, O Lord, come, or possibly it means Maranatha, our Lord has come. So there's two possible meanings for this phrase. Maranatha, Lord, please come, or Maranatha, our Lord has come. So one of those two is the meaning that it has, and it's an Aramaic phrase. So evidently it was something that the church members were saying to one another as a kind of church in-speak, or maybe when they wanted to make a point emphatically, they would use that Aramaic phrase to make the point. And so Paul writes it in Greek letters here and doesn't translate it because evidently it was something that they all understood, a phrase that they were all using. So you see that, as I said, the New Testament then was written in Greek, and if you look at 1 Corinthians 1, and I'm almost finished, in 1 Corinthians 1, I want to go to Jews, to verse 22, okay, 1 Corinthians 1:22. For Jews request a sign, and Greeks seek after wisdom. So the Hebrew language you could describe as graphic, picturesque. You could describe Greek as a very good language for developing a theological point. And you might say, perhaps in some sense, biblical Hebrew is very emotional, very powerful, and biblical Greek is perhaps more intellectual and refined, in a general sense. Now, both languages have developed, and biblical Hebrew over time developed its own vocabulary and so on for philosophical discussion, but I'm talking about the way the languages were in the first century. So perhaps you could say that the Jews request a sign and the Greeks seek after wisdom to some degree characterizes the two languages of Hebrew and Greek. You could make that point, but I don't want to belabor it. So let's go back and summarize what I talked about today. God used three different languages to preserve his scriptures for the three different branches of humankind, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He used Hebrew and Aramaic, written with the same alphabet, two languages which we call linguistically Semitic languages, interrelated languages of the Middle East, but yet different. One used by the Israelites, and then one used in the wider Gentile world. Then he used a language which was a separate language linguistically, an Indo-European language, a language which was in a way a mother of many European languages or influenced them, the Greek language, which was the basis of Western civilization. He used the Greek language then for the New Testament. So obviously, God's church is in no way constituted to preserve the scriptures. Right now you could barely find God's church. So you need to have a group of people whom God would authorize to preserve his word. So he gave, as we know from Romans 3, he gave his Old Testament scriptures to the Jews, and we know from what we read in Romans also, what I said in Romans 1 and 2 and the book of Revelation, he gave his New Testament scriptures to the Greeks to preserve, which they have done. The Jews have preserved the Hebrew Bible down to this day. I have one in front of me now. This is a Hebrew-English Tanakh. It's a Bible in Hebrew, and now I have this old, this old beaten up diaglot. This is a Greek English New Testament that I'm holding up now. So those peoples have in fact preserved the scriptures for us. It's not for us to decide what belongs in the Bible. It's for the Jews to decide what belongs in the Old Testament, for the Greeks to decide what belongs in the New Testament. For us, the church, it's our responsibility to understand it and to do it, to preserve it. God chose those peoples to preserve it. Now I want to finish by going to Revelation, the 7th chapter, and back to the beginning here of how God wants all languages ultimately to be dedicated to his purpose. Revelation 7, here's this beautiful vision that John sees, and it's a Festival of Tabernacles type of a vision. People dressed in white, praising God, waving palm fronds. It's a Festival of Tabernacles type of vision. And the Jews associated the Festival of Tabernacles with all the various nations of the world coming together to worship God. There are reasons for that I won't go into now. Revelation 7 and verse 9. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So this is where history is going. Now, if anybody has any questions on that or anything, feel free. Now, if there's some issue that comes up that I feel could best be handled privately with you or at a later time, I'll say so. And obviously, if I don't know the answer, obviously I ought to say so if I have any kind of integrity. But if there's anything you want to talk about what I covered today or in general, evidently you do have a time for discussion. So here we are. Time has now come for discussion.
Okay. What we generally will do is if you have a webcam, you have something to say, turn your webcam on, then we know that you would like to speak. We also have the chat room. There's a chat room you can type in if you don't want to say, or you're kind of shy and don't want to talk, or if you want something, you want to say, hey, I got something to say, you can do it in the chat room, and we can address you. Can you give your website and time again when you message? It's CCK.
CCK153.org. CCK153.org. Services, a live talk is given at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time every Sabbath, and most holy days the service is at 2 p.m. as well. Once in a while we'll have a morning service on a holy day. And they're archived, so you can see, I don't know, maybe a year's worth of them are out there. So if you want to go back and there's some topic that may interest you, there are quite a collection of them available now, archived.
Okay, and now
So
for the feast,
the opportunity to share that.
No, that's fine. We don't, we're not like exclusive to ourselves, and we try to, help other people, spread the word.
Well, thanks a lot.
Your feast site is going to be near Washington, D.C. this year?
Yes, and if anybody wants more specific details, go contact us, and we'll let you know more specifically where we're going to be and more of the details. But we'll be at Washington, D.C. That's Washington.com. I'm kidding. Anyway, we're going to be at Washington, D.C. this year, God willing.
Okay, well, if you get the information together, be sure to notify Peggy so she can put it on feastgoer.org. That's the feast directory page that we host.
Oh, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
I know that we were in communication last year. Last year we were in this area, Central Florida, but there was a group in Moravia, Iowa, and we were in touch with, we were in communication with the minister up there, with Hal Geiger, and I exchanged notes during that time of the year. Hal was a student of mine way back when.
Well, hopefully you'll be doing a seminar live to Moravia from your feast site if we can work that out.
Oh, we'd love to do that.
So it looks like Chris DeWeese has something to say. So we'll leave it. Chris's webcam looks like it's not cooperating. Oh, and then we have something in the chat room too. Let's do Let's do Chris first, and then we'll read Jim Rudd's question in the chat room. So, Chris, you want to go?
Yeah, that's, I don't know, can you guys hear me?
I can.
Okay, that's good, because I can't see me, so I didn't know that part was working or not.
Well,
So,
that part is not working. We can't see you.
Okay, that's all right. I probably, would break the camera or something. But at any rate, I think it's really interesting that you're keeping Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, in Washington, D.C. And hopefully you could have a million-man march of people in the name of God. That would be wonderful to have to wave the lulav right there on the lawn, But you were talking about how the Bible switches languages, and that is fascinating to me. And I was just wondering, does it do that in all of the ancient manuscripts, or some of them? When you said in Daniel, it went from one language to another, and that's new information to me, but it's very cool information, because it's actually switching languages. You would never know that if you only ever read English Bibles. So I was just curious to know if it does it in a bunch of manuscripts.
You might check your margin. If you've got a good Bible, the margin will tell you that the languages have switched, if you have a good margin. So it's not like it's mystical. It's there in your margin if you have a good margin. Or you may not. Maybe you just got a little pocket, little Bible or something, or maybe your smartphone, you read the Bible on your smartphone, and maybe it doesn't have marginal notes. But generally speaking, a good translation will show you what languages switch. So that's what I was
no,
saying
sir. I was not challenging you on that or saying it was mystical in any stretch. I totally am not challenging you. I was just wondering if all of the ancient manuscripts do that, because I know that there's different sources of.
Well, you see, we have manuscripts. I think it would depend on the book how old the manuscripts are, but there's no debate that I know of about what I've said about the switch in languages. For example, the Pentateuch, that Laban calls it by one name and Jacob by another. As far as I know, that's not in dispute. And the Aramaic sections of Daniel and the Hebrew and Aramaic. I mean, as far as I've never seen any disputes about those particular points that I know of. So I'm not familiar with in whatever I've read or studied that there's divergence in those areas.
Okay, cool. No, it made perfect sense. I was just curious about it. That's all. Trivial Pursuit type stuff. Thanks.
Okay.
So that would have been the end of my question, Don. So thank you for letting me have some mic time.
Okay. Can you, Mark? Can you see the chat room? Jim Rudd has put a question in there. If you can't, I'll try to read it.
Just go ahead and read it because I don't see it here. I'm afraid if I touch something, it'll explode or something.
Oh no, it won't explode.
I mean, if you want to read the question, I'll try to listen carefully to it.
Okay. Well, my reading is probably going to butcher it, but question for Mr. Kaplan. From someone who had his fridge in tow years while at AC.
Had his what?
Had his fridge for tow years. Okay, like I said, if I read it, it's going to get butchered.
Oh, he had my refrigerator for 2 years. Yeah, that's what happened. Yeah, wow, I'd forgotten that. What happened was we suddenly had to move from Big Sandy to Pasadena, and some married student took our refrigerator. I didn't realize. I'd forgotten that. Sorry about that. I'm sorry that I didn't remember you right off. But that was about 1990, and that was a while ago. But I do want to apologize for not remembering that you had my refrigerator. I apologize. But in my defense, it was back in 1990 or 1991, I guess it was, that we had to move back to 1991. We had to quickly move back to Pasadena around Labor Day of 1991, and so we had to get rid of some of our. So we had to give away some of our things, and that's when they told me to get a PhD, and I went back to USC to do it. And so anyway, I do want to apologize for not remembering you. but thanks for reminding me of that.
Anyways, that was the first part of the question.
Okay.
I love and agree with our views about language, but how does that relate to the Passover timing?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
Well, go ahead. Keep reading. Keep reading.
Okay. I have to say I agree with the Passover sacrifice was killed on the late 14th. I understand that this is problematic for some, but I am not a linguist and would love your input on the subject, especially since I see Acts 15 being about the controversy about eating the Passover with someone like Titus who was not circumcised. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too bad.
Well, first of all, it doesn't mention eating the Passover in Acts 15. Titus could not have eaten the Old Testament Passover, but he was not required to. Titus was not required to eat the Old Testament Passover. He was a New Testament Christian, and Jesus Christ is our Passover. And so if you're a Gentile and you become part of the church, you don't need to be circumcised. That's a clear decision in Acts 15. So that means you cannot eat the Old Testament Passover, but you don't need to eat it. Jesus Christ is our Passover. And so if you are a New Testament Christian, you're not required to do it. And, you cannot do it unless you're circumcised, but you're not required to do it. So it's a non-issue to a New Testament Christian. Whether or not you can eat the Passover is a non-issue to a New Testament Christian, because as I said, that's what we see clearly in the Book of Acts, that you don't have to be circumcised to be part of the new covenant. And so that means you don't have to first, do the old covenant and then the new. You can go from completely unconverted to completely converted without becoming an Israelite. And there's no intermediary step needed. That's been decided, as of Acts 15 officially. It was already decided before Acts 15, but it became official in Acts 15. So Titus would not have eaten the Old Testament Passover, nor would he have needed to do it. Now, regarding linguistics, what can I say? Only in a small circle of people who came out of a certain tradition is this even a dispute. I mean, out in the world in general, if you look at dictionaries, encyclopedias, whatever, this is not even an issue. It has become an issue within a rather small circle of people because of certain teachings that were enforced at a certain time, but they were not really based upon linguistics. They were based upon reading the New Testament and getting the impression of what was going on there, and then reading that back into the Old Testament material. So it was done by somebody who was reading it in English, and then taking the English translation he had, and then from what he could understand about what's going on in the New Testament in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what seemed to be going on there, he then read that back into the Old Testament and drew his conclusions. And so it wasn't based on Hebrew or Greek, but just on a reading of the Bible in English and then interpreting it as he did. And as I said, there's that doesn't mean, obviously whether or not a small group of people believe it doesn't make it right or wrong, but I just want to let you know it's not a major issue out there, generally speaking, for people who read the Bible. But it is an issue for people who came out of a certain heritage. And basically, I suppose, to be frank, the Church of God has been wrestling with the issue within that community of the so-called cogs. That's where it is an issue. But in general, people understand. You killed the lamb at the end of the 14th. You ate it that night, the 15th, to begin the festival, and that's the way it's been. But it's not a linguistic issue so much as I believe it's based on reading the New Testament, seeing what the apostles did with Jesus Christ, drawing a conclusion there, and then reading that back into the Old Testament. That's what I think was happening there. But this is, of course, a very major subject, at least within our social circle, you could say, and I have covered it at length in talks in the past, and if you want to maybe go back and check, perhaps my website may have talks on it, but there's good material on it, depending on what your heritage is. I'll tell you what groups understood it correctly, in my opinion. The Church of God International, from its inception in 1978. I've never been a member of the Church of God International, but that family of churches, CGI, that family has always understood the chronology in the book of Exodus. So they have good material on it. So you don't have to get it from me. You could get it maybe from, I suppose, Ron Dard and those who came out of that heritage CGI. I'm trying to think of that fellow who wrote some of those learned articles for CGI. You know who I'm thinking of? What's his name? No, who wrote for CGI? What? Yeah, Vance Stinson. I don't know Vance Stinson. I'm not sure I ever even saw him. But he's written articles on it, perhaps Vance Stinson. Or if you want to check, my website, as I said, I have material on it. And I'd be happy to talk at length to the person involved at some other time about the subject too. Be happy to do it. I have I have scars, you could say, from these battles within the community over this subject. I could go into a whole history of all the battles. In fact, I'm going to really shock a lot of you now. Do you have time for this story? I'm going to tell you a story that's going to shock a lot of you, but you'll probably find it interesting, or I wouldn't tell it. There's a book out by a man named Mike Fizzell. It's called The Liberation of the Worldwide Church of God. It's by Mike Fizzell. And in that book, he blames what happened on me. What he says, and he wasn't lying, he just misunderstood. He wasn't being dishonest. Mike Fizzell, in that book, The Liberation of the Worldwide Church of God, says that I circulated a paper, I guess maybe shortly after the death of Mr. Armstrong, and in that paper, I proved that the Jews are correct in and the chronology of Exodus 12. That the way the Jews understand Exodus 12 is in fact correct. And he said, he mentioned my name in the book. He said, I circulated a paper that indicated that the Jews were correct in Exodus 12. And then once he understood that, he said, well, if Mr. Armstrong could make a mistake on that, maybe he could make a mistake on other things. And so this whole, chain developed where the church, as you know, Protestantized. Now it's called Grace Communion International. It completely Protestantized. And actually, I'm not really to blame in a sense. I didn't write a paper. He confused me with another minister of Jewish descent who wrote a paper. I didn't write a paper. But, he wasn't being dishonest. He mistook me with somebody else. I did, however, have a discussion with him and Mr. Tkach after Mr. Armstrong died about the subject. And what happened was Mr. Tkach understood that the Jews were correct on their chronology of Exodus 12, but it didn't change what we did as a church. See, that's the thing. It didn't change our practice. So there was no reason to make an issue over it. Mr. Armstrong died January of '86. So now March of '86 is there. We're coming to the Passover, and there's no reason to say anything about it that year. And so we had a meeting, Mike Fizzell, Joe Tkach, and I, and so that's possibly why another reason why Mike thought that I was responsible for the paper, which I was not. But anyway, the next year, I believe it was, Mr. Tkach said, this is a historical question. It doesn't change our practice. It's a historical question, so you're free to teach what you believe. And so, fortunately, I was able to teach, what I believed. Then, in 1989, he officially established it as church doctrine that the Jews were correct on Exodus 12, and there were lectures given which were called the Deacon and Elders lectures, the Dells lectures. Dr. Stavronidis wrote some material on it in the Pastor General's report, whatever they called it in those days, Ministerial Bulletin or whatever they called it. And Dr. Hay gave a lecture which was videotaped and is available. Another reason why I think Mike Fizzell blames me for all the changes. I gave a sermon in 1988 in the auditorium in Pasadena about what I have noticed in the Bible then, 10 covenants. Now, I've actually found more. I gave a sermon about a week ago on 13 covenants. It was either a week or 2 weeks ago. No, I guess I gave it on Pentecost, where I actually have found 13 covenants. These are divine covenants, not an agreement like between Laban and Jacob. but where God says he's going to do this or that, divine covenant. So I found 13. Well, anyway, back then I thought there were 10, and nobody corrected me. I gave a sermon in 1988 in the auditorium in Pasadena on the 10 covenants, and I was very innocent about it. I didn't realize I was being revolutionary, but I ended the sermon by saying, we are under the new covenant. Well, of course, Christians are under the new covenant, but somehow that was revolutionary at the time. People were all, excited about it. And see, in those days, we had a very hierarchical way of looking at the world. And the fact that I was the speaker in the PM church gave me some status, as if, God wouldn't have allowed me to say something wrong if I was doing the PM service at headquarters. So therefore, the fact that I said it from the pulpit in the PM church in Pasadena, it now had a certain authority behind it, that we were actually a new covenant church. And I didn't realize that what I was saying something radical, but at the time, evidently it was. And maybe the fact that I gave that talk about the new covenant, that was in 1988, and that might have had some impact on the various ones that made the changes later. But that, of course, that was not my intent. I mean, so that may be another reason why they feel they blame me for the changes. But anyway, sorry to go into all of that, but I thought you might find it interesting.
Any other questions out there? Jim says thank you. He agrees with the Passover sacrifice being killed late on the 14th. Just thinking this is actually what Acts 15 was about. Thank you for your input, Jim Rod.
Well, I appreciate that. And as I said, if Jim wants to get in touch with me further about the subject, believe it or not, it was a very hot topic in our community, and it led me to be condemned. There was a publication called In Transition, which later on was called The Journal, and there was an article in The Journal where I was mentioned along with Ron Dart and Garner Ted Armstrong, of course, who has since died. But our three names were in the article, and we were condemned because of what we taught about Exodus 12, and we, people were warned about us and how we were spreading this idea that that was as I said, a very controversial idea in the church. So as I said, I'm sorry that it became such a hot issue and still is to some people. But I'd be happy to talk about it with Jim privately.
Any other questions, comments, suggestions, mentions?
Is Debbie out there today? Debbie Roth, is she there? In your group?
I don't see her in the list tonight. She may
okay, well, anyway, we wish her well. I know she's had health issues.
Your phone.
Pardon me?
She might be listening.
Anyway, we wish her well. I know she's had health issues, so we wish her well. If Mike and Jim are there, we miss them.
Mike is in here somewhere. There he is.
Okay, well, if Mike and Jim are there, again, regards to you.
Well, I can't believe it's so quiet. We got some big...
I'm going to ask a question.
Yes.
What about using names? Like I have been with a group recently. They use the name Yeshua instead of Jesus. I didn't want to get into a big thing.
Let me say a few things about that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can finish with this because I know it's getting late. So this should be the last question. But if somebody else wants to ask questions, you can get a hold of me maybe after the study or later on today, or to use a more worldly term, tomorrow, or any other time. But people sometimes make an issue about names. The Jews did not want to pronounce God's name, so when they came to the letters YHWH, they put in different vowels so that the name would be pronounced Adonai, a respectful term for God, which is translated Lord in the Bible, in the English Bible. So when the scholars in the Renaissance saw the term, or perhaps even earlier, they saw the consonants for Yahweh, but the vowels for Adonai, so they made a concocted word, Jehovah. And so Jehovah became a name for God in English. But Jehovah is not a Hebrew word. It's a concoction. It's based on the vowels for one word and the consonants for another. And so Jehovah took on a life all its own. And now in the English language, one of the names for God is Jehovah. Now, Messianic Judaism, which is a Protestant sect, generally speaking, Messianic Judaism has taken this term Yeshua, and it seems to me also a concoction. Now, I have attended Messianic congregations. I spoke to one Messianic leader in Garden Grove, California, very fine man. His name was Ezra. I'm trying to think of his last name. Ezra Schley? Ezra Schley? He's a very fine man. Comes from Haifa area. He's an Israeli. He was in the Israeli army at one time. He had a Messianic group in Garden Grove, and I've been with them from time to time, and I've been with other ones. But I never have gotten an explanation as to why they insist on Yeshua, which is a concoction, again, like Jehovah is a concoction. Here's the story. If you look in Genesis 14, Numbers 14, you find that, Numbers 13, you find that we had a man who's called Hoshea bin Nun, Hoshea the son of Nun, and let's go to verse 16, all right? If you're with me, if you're following this question, is this from that lady in Baltimore?
Yes.
Oh, Marjorie. You're Marjorie?
Yes.
Are you within the city limits of Baltimore?
No, I'm 20 miles northeast.
Good. All right, anyway, with all due respect, I mean, I enjoyed the time I spent in Baltimore, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, Numbers 13:16. These are the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. And Moses called Hoshea, the son of Nun, Joshua, or Yehoshua, which means the eternal is salvation. And that is the name given to Jesus Christ. And in the Greek it's Jesus, but it's coming from this word, Yehoshua, but this word is in transition. You see, in later Old Testament times it was shortened. And I'll give you an example of that in, I think we can find that in, perhaps in Haggai. Let's go to the book of Haggai, see if it's there. No, he still uses the word Joshua. So let's go to Ezra and Nehemiah. See, what happened is at the end of the Old Testament period, they began shortening Yehoshua to Yeshua. And let's go to Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, let's go to Ezra. Look at Ezra 3:2, okay? Ezra 3:2. Then Jeshua, the son of Josedek. So you see, they went from Yehoshua, Joshua, to Yeshua, a shortened form of the name. So now it became Yeshua. And so from Yeshua, we went to Jesus in the Greek. And in Aramaic, evidently he was called Yeshua. And if you may have seen parts of this movie that Australian, what's that devout Catholic Australian made this movie, Passion of the Christ. Oh, Mel Gibson. Okay, Mel Gibson made this movie, Passion of the Christ, and he had the Jews speak in Aramaic. And when they talked about Christ there, they called him Yeshua. That was his name. His Hebrew name would have been Yehoshua, but because they were speaking Aramaic, they probably called him Yeshua. All right, now, the Messianic Jews come along, and they take the word Yeshua. Now, there is a Hebrew word, a feminine word, Yeshua, which means salvation. Yeshua, which means salvation. You'll find it in the Psalms. In in Psalm 116, in verse 13, it says, if you're in Psalm 113, verse 13, it says, Psalm 116, verse 13, it says, I will take up the cup of salvation. And the Hebrew word is Yeshua, which is feminine. It's a feminine word grammatically. You know what I'm saying? Some languages have masculine and feminine in terms of grammar, like Spanish and French. And Hebrew has masculine and feminine in terms of grammar. So Yeshua is a feminine word grammatically. I will take up the cup of salvation. Now they have decided to drop off the hey at the end of the word and say Yeshua and make a masculine word out of the word for salvation and concoct a name for Jesus and call him Yeshua, which is concocted. It's just like the name Jehovah is concocted. Now they may have a good reason for it. I don't know what the reason is. I talked to Ezra about it, Ezra Schley. He didn't give me a good explanation. I'm not condemning him for that. I've never seen a good explanation as to why they came up with this concoction. Now, if you ask me why they want to call him Yeshua instead of calling him Jesus, it has to do with marketing. There are two reasons why. One is they want to emphasize the Hebrew roots of the New Testament. They want there to be an understanding that the New Testament began in a Jewish environment, that Jesus was Jewish, and the early Christians were Jewish, so that's one reason they do it. The second reason is because they feel somehow Jews will be more comfortable if they don't hear Jesus, if they hear Yeshua. That a Jew, you know, if he ever is going to become a Christian, would just be so bent out of shape believing in Jesus, you know. But if he says Yeshua, somehow that'll be more palatable. So it's a proselytizing tool. So for those two reasons they do it, to emphasize the Jewish roots of Christianity and in order to proselytize Jews. That's why they do it. So I think that probably should be the last question. I'm sorry that I just ranted on, but I wanted to give you a good answer, a decent answer anyway. By the way, if any of you do know why the Messianic Jews have done that, you can let me know why they've done it. I know why they've done it, but I mean why they took that particular term. Instead of calling him Yeshua the way Mel Gibson did, why they concocted the term Yeshua, why they did it. I don't know why they did it. So I guess, is Don still on?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm reading a comment from Jim Rudd here.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? Usually this is a lively bunch we got here. You must have nailed it right on the head.
Well, it's been a long, hard week for a lot of them, I guess.
Some of the people that are on. Oh, here you go. Here's Chris. Did you try?
I'm one of the people who would say Yeshua instead of Jesus, but in our assembly, anything goes. We're certainly not dogmatic by any stretch of the imagination. So even during messages, you would hear Jesus or God or Yahweh or whatever. Most of the folks who get into it would believe that Yeshua is a shortened version of Yehoshua. Some people would say Yahshua.
But it isn't. And I don't know why. I don't know why they've chosen that. I don't know why they've chosen.
It's just universally accepted. I mean,
No,
it's
it
the
is.
same reason that
It is not universally accepted. Mel Gibson in his movie did not have them pronouncing it that way because he was authentic. They were speaking Aramaic and calling him Yeshua, which is what his name was. His name was not Yeshua.
what I'm
I don't
saying
know. As
by
I said,
universally accepted.
I don't know why Messianic Jews chose that. I don't know why. But I mean, they may have a good explanation and a good reason, but it is a concocted term. By the way, the Orthodox Jewish New Testament, which is a wonderful translation, the Orthodox Jewish Brit Chadashah, believe it or not, somebody went to the trouble of translating the New Testament for Orthodox Jews. If I had had that translation when I was a young man, it would have been just a joy to me. I came into the church in 1968 out of an ultra-Orthodox environment, and I went from that to the church. And if I had had that translation, it would have been very useful. But they call him in that translation Yehoshua. They go back to the original Hebrew. They don't even call him Yeshua. They go back to Yehoshua, which I think, again, is maybe a little bit extreme because, as I said, by the end of the Old Testament period, as I showed you in the Bible, they were using the term Yeshua rather than Yehoshua, at least some of the time. Although it is true that the name Yehoshua is still used by Jews. There were rabbis with that name in ancient times. So, in fact, actually, Yehoshua is more popular among Jews now. And I believe, frankly, the reason why Jews are now using Yehoshua so much is because probably Yeshua, because, his followers became a separate sect and became Christianity. I think that's why Jews were turned off on the name Yeshua, and that's why they went back to Yehoshua, probably. That's probably why, because they didn't want to have their kids having the name Yeshua, because now he was he'd founded in effect a new religion from their point of view. So nowadays Jews go back to Yehoshua, and Joshua is a popular name among Jews, and it has been for many, many centuries. But as I said, Yeshua was also used at the time of Christ. Yehoshua and Yeshua were both used. And as I said, if you go to the Jewish translation, it's called the Orthodox Jewish Brit Chadashah. You can look it up. You can Google it. It's out there. It's a wonderful translation, but it's filled with in-speak. It's the kind of a translation that an ex rabbinical student would enjoy, because it's just filled with in-speak. But they call Jesus there Yehoshua. But if you find a leader of the Messianic Jews, and if he can tell you why they came up with that concoction, I would be interested to find out why.
Hi, this is Mike Waters, and
Yes.
hello back. But in listening to Chris, I think I understand it exactly why they say it that way. In other words, it could be that Yeshua is more of an easier way for an American to pronounce the Aramaic, even though it's not technically correct Aramaic. I noticed there's a lot of dialect, American, speaking with an American accent within the Messianic community, and so they'll pronounce words that you might not understand it if you're a Hebrew or an Aramaic speaker, but if you look at it from the point of view of speaking it in a American dialect, kind of like the Southern dialect, you might say. It might be, say, the Southern way to say Yeshua.
Okay, let me show you why that explanation is not going to work. I mean, with all due respect, you're a good friend of mine. You go to the Jewish New Testament commentary by David Stern, and he makes a major point of saying that the word Yeshua is a masculine form of the noun salvation. Now, the noun salvation in Hebrew is Yeshua. It ends with a hey. It's a feminine term. On the other hand, the Messianic Jews take the hey off, and they have a new concocted word, which is not a Hebrew word, but it's a masculine form of the Hebrew word for salvation, and they pronounce it Yeshua without the hey. But he doesn't say why they do that. But if you look at the Jewish New Testament commentary, you probably own it. And you look what he says there, and he'll say it's a masculine form of the Hebrew word for salvation, but he doesn't say why they have taken that on.
Now, if you
can find a reason, Mike, let me know why they. But it's not because of pronunciation. They've made a deliberate decision.
Oh, okay. Well, what I was thinking is that
you can look at the Jewish New Testament commentary by David Stern.
Oh, okay. Well, that'll be interesting to see if. I was just thinking it's like a Southerner when they say antifreeze, they'll say antifreeze. Like,
no, but there's more to it than that. That's why I made such a point of it, my friend.
Okay, very good. Then that'll be something I think for people to consider. That it's not just an Americanization; it's actually
no, it's not. It's a deliberate decision. I just don't know why.
Okay, good point.
Any other comments, questions relating to the presentation?
Well, I mean, you don't have to drag it out. It's already been more than an hour and a half. These people have to have a life,
Well, just making sure.
Okay.
All right. With that, okay. Gail says, thank you, Mark. It's been very informative. Yep, everybody's starting to bail now. So
Okay.
with that, I'll say thank you for speaking and giving us that message. And
Thank you.
we really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and all the best to all of you who listened. And I appreciate you taking the effort to do it. You're to be given, I hope, extra